First, I want to say hello from Germany, and then I want to thank the ID group and especially my MEB colleague Ivan David, who is the organizer of this conference, and many thanks for inviting me for this conference. And also a heartfelt hello to everyone out there listening. So now let's start with my presentation and see if this is working. Okay, so okay. So I think it is working now. Perfect. Okay. Well, my today's topic is farm to fork, a threat to European agriculture. And this is deliberately without a question mark because I would like to have this heading read as a statement. Yes, the farm to forks strategy sees farmers and agriculture as polluters and destroyers of the environment. And according to the EU Commission, only a transition to sustainable, for example, ecological agriculture will change this. The quotes on the slides are taken verbatim from the EU Commission's text from May 2020. And in addition to the restructuring of agriculture through numerous regulations, my topic today, this is to be achieved through the re-education of citizens in their eating habits. This is what the text verbatim says. It is clear that the transition will not happen without a shift in people's diet. In other words, no meat, fewer animal products, and algae and insects should be included in our future nutrition plan. In addition, sustainability is to become the most important aspect of the corporate strategy in food processing, and in global shift towards sustainable agriculture shall be supported. For example, this is addressed by the regulation recently adopted by the EU Parliament for products associated with deforestation. But this is nothing less than a new EU imperialism with a green doctrine, which is primarily intended to ensure that the EU Commission has control of trade and financial flows. But back to the agriculture, and here comes a short reminder who were the supporters of this strategy in the EU Parliament. Although we did not vote on the Commission text since this was a communication, there was still an EU Parliament resolution with the same name, and that was voted on. You can see the voting behavior on the slide. From the beginning, it was the ECR and the ID groups that spoke out against that strategy that endangers our food security. And it was the Christian Democrats, the EPP group of the European People's Party, whose votes made the implementation of this green ideology possible in the past 4.5 years. A biodiversity strategy 2030 was published by the Commission at the same time as the farm to fork strategy, and most of the targets for implementing the Green Deal can be found in both of those strategies, such as the reduction of pesticides by 50%, or ecological management of at least 25% of all agricultural land, or the renaturation of at least 30% of all land and marine areas by 2030. The focus here is primarily on preserving biodiversity, and the underlying core message here is that our traditional cultivated landscape and our farmland are fueling the extinction of the species and threatening our health. Biodiversity and farm to fork strategy shall become the new agricultural business model according to the EU Commission and the majority of the EU Parliament. Let's take a look at the impact of statutory quotas for organic farming. On average, in the EU, the proportion of organically farmed land is around 9%, with large differences between the different member states. Germany is at 9.5 the Czech Republic at 15%, but the Netherlands, Poland, Hungary, or Norway are between 4 or 6%. And it is always argued that the decline in biodiversity with conventional farmed land is significantly higher than on organic land. But this is only true if you look at the area and not at the yield. In addition to the fact that there is no scientific standard for quantifying biodiversity. And depending on the crop, there are considerable differences in yield between the conventional and the organic farming. In organic farming, in different studies, a drop in yield between 50 and 60% is reported for wheat or potatoes, and an average of around 40% decline for oilseed. This means that organic farming performs significantly worse even in terms of biodiversity. One study estimates a 55% higher loss of biodiversity in organic farming. And in addition, food production is being relocated to third countries, often to areas that have a significantly higher biodiversity index than the arable land within the EU. And while the world's population had risen steadily, agricultural land actually declined slightly. And this trend would be significantly reversed if high-yield farming would be banned by law. Statistics predict an increase to around 10 billion people by 2050, even without the Green Deal. Feeding ourselves in the future will be a challenge. And in the following, I will briefly present 3 of the legislative texts announced in the Farm to Fork strategy and the impact on the European agriculture, starting with a new green business model, the carbon dioxide sequestration by farmers and foresters. According to the EU Commission, climate-efficient agriculture should make its contribution to achieving climate neutrality by 2050. And the proposal for a regulation, which the Commission put forward a year ago in November 2022, contains rules for the recognition of carbon dioxide removal certification systems. According to the Commission, examples of climate-efficient agriculture that permanently stores carbon dioxide in soils and forests include the revetting of peatlands, afforestation, increasing landscape features such as hedges, bushes, ponds, dry stone walls, and the like, and even on top of all that, the targeted conversion of cropland to fallow. By means of certification, these practices are intended to be the new sources of income for farmers, foresters, and land managers. And the exact wording of the Commission, which I think is very interesting, reads as follows. The carbon removal certificates can be used for result-based rewards by private, which mean food companies, or public sources, which means your taxpayers' money, of course. And while farmers will benefit from additional income, food companies can credibly document their carbon footprint. So farmers are no longer producers of food and secure our food supply. They are being turned into carbon dioxide gardeners by law. While their income revenue is no longer based on crop yields and market prices, but it is replaced by a fictitious carbon dioxide subsidy. Society's food supply is being as outsourced to third countries, and this will have, of course, negative effects on biodiversity when natural habits are converted into additional arable land. And in extreme cases, it can even endanger globally the food supply of vulnerable groups. Already, this Commission's version and the underlying green ideology is very difficult to digest. But then The regulation was not only adopted by the EU Parliament in the first reading with an overwhelming majority, as you can see, but the regulation was even made stricter in Parliament. In addition to carbon dioxide, the certification of methane and nitrous oxide was included, and this is also very hard to believe. Methane emissions from intestinal fermentation were included in the legal text. Unnoticed by almost all MEPs, this was the first step towards a regulating livestock by their methane emissions. Let's go further. So another regulation that will come into force is the regulation on nature restoration. And the trilogue negotiations were already completed on November 9th, and only yesterday the Environmental Committee in charge approved the trilogue results by 53 to 28. It is interesting. It is very interesting to note how divided the EPP group voted. Over the past 4.5 years, their votes in particular have generated majorities for green nonsense. Yet it is precisely those and their MEPs, especially in Germany, where I come from, who claim to stand up for the concerns of the farmers. And this law is associated with set-asides, yield losses, bans, and massive interventions in agricultural management methods, and thus opens the door to legally questionable encroachments on fundamental rights. This is exacerbated by imprecise definitions such as good status or what is a favorable reference area, which create considerable legal uncertainty. Farmers are being deprived of fertile land, especially after trilogue negotiations reintroduced content into the legislative text that was rejected before in Parliament at first reading. This includes, for example, the re-wetting of peatlands, which is now to be voluntary. However, it is explicitly stated that this is without prejudice to obligations arising from national law. And this is precisely what member states could be forced to do if they have to meet their specified quotas. And also Article 9, which mandates the renaturation measures on agricultural land, was also reintroduced into the regulation. The last regulation I would like to refer to in connection with the Farm to Fork strategy is the regulation on the sustainable use of plant protection regulation, which I have been closely involved in over the last year as a shadow rapporteur for our ID group. Following negotiations between the EPP, the ECR, the ID, and the Renew Group, the original plan was to block this regulation already in the Responsible Environment Committee because it is simply toxic for our European agriculture. However, after the failure to reject the nature restoration regulation in Parliament, the EPP group, together with the ECR shadow rapporteur, decided to enter into negotiations. So, the rejection of the SUR in the EU Parliament at the November plenary session was reported in detail in the media. Nevertheless, I would like to have 3 remarks here. Firstly, the rejection decided by some 250 to 207 was not decided with the votes of the EPP group, as you can see here on the slide. And secondly, it was not the Commission proposal that was rejected, but it was the version adopted by the EU Parliament. That means that in principle, there is still the possibility of a second reading in the EU Parliament. That is, if the Council does not approve the EU Parliament's position, and in that event of a second reading, it is very questionable whether the Parliament will be able to table own amendments again. So here, only an approval of the rejection of the Commission's proposal tabled by our own ID group would have ended the legislative procedure. But this was not adopted, depicted on the right side of the slide. And thirdly, the majority of the EPP's amendments were approved only with the help of the votes of the ID group. For example, the amendment transferring designation of sensitive areas in the responsibility of the member states. So to talk of a political firewall on the part of the EPP is therefore becoming increasingly ridiculous. So the Plant Protection Regulation was the first time, at least during my mandate, that I saw farmers really fighting back and their associations doing real serious lobbying in Brussels. The implementation of this regulation would have meant the end for many, many farms, a general reduction of so-called chemical plant protection products without appropriate and effective alternatives would have simply meant that for many crops there would either have no or only very few different approved pesticides. The result would be increased residue formation. Also, the term chemical itself is misleading. Water is a chemical compound. Also, the so-called ecological pesticides are chemical compounds, which, by the way, are often just as or even more harmful to the environment, to insects, or to humans. And on top of the use of pesticides would have been completely banned in the so-called sensitive areas. I have received letters from farmers who reported that 70% and in one case even 90% of their arable land was in those so-called sensitive areas. So no longer farming would be possible there. In Germany, depending on the region, up to 90% of the land would have been affected. Further, there would have been extensive bureaucratic requirements. For example, the recording of all preventive measures in a central digital register. Even the most trivial actions, such as cleaning their appliances, would have need to be recorded. And before using so-called chemical pesticides, extensive documentation and monitoring of the corresponding pest infestation would be necessary. An absolute absurdity, which has nothing to do with consumer protection, but would simply have led to the widespread abolition of agriculture, especially the cultivation of wines in the EU. We can only hope that either the Council will follow EU Parliament or the EU Commission will withdraw the legislative proposal. However, if nothing significant changes in the composition of the EU Parliament and the EU Commission after the election next year, the fight for this regulation will continue in the next period, and the outcome is uncertain. The realization that food security is the foundation of our society must prevail, especially in the urban population, where the reality of agriculture and food production is far away. So here I have brought with me some quotes from the letters of farmers who have contacted me, and I think they speak for themselves. Like, agriculture takes place on living soil, and no 2 years are the same. Crop protection cannot be enforced by law and date if it is to be successful. For generations, we have protected our soil as our most important resource in order to pass it on to our next generations in the best possible condition. Or this one, as plant protection products are extremely expensive, we try to use them as sparingly as possible at the moment. Or as a farm, we already literally surrounded by bureaucracy, regulations, and documentation requirements. Or here another one who invested in 2018 around 1 million euros in more animal welfare and modern precision farming technology. And he says, if I were to be banned from using pesticides, the existence of my farm would be at stake, as 90% of the land would be in a protected area. Or this one here, crops such as vegetables, potatoes, oilseed, and sugar beet could no longer be grown in the protected areas. Self-determined and entrepreneurial farming is therefore no longer possible. And this is a good point too. If organic farming becomes mandatory by law, prices for organic products will come under severe pressure as the markets will be no longer able to absorb these additional products. The necessary price gap between organic products and conventional goods will be drastically reduced, which will put many of these organic farms in financial difficulties through no fault of their own. Well, the consequences of those green agricultural mismanagement are very clear. Even a study mandated by the Commission concluded in January 2021 that the farm-to-fork strategy will lead to a pronounced decline in food production within the EU. Whether this was the reason why this study was not published for more than over half a year is of course purely speculative. But it does raise questions about how unwelcome facts are dealt with. In addition to the decline in food production, which has been predicted in countless studies, the disappearance of farms will continue to increase. In Germany, statistics show that 3,560 farms have closed their doors for good every year over the last 10 years, and the trend continues unabated. Pig farms are currently particularly affected. In the EU, the decline has also been drastic. In the last 10 years alone, the number of farms has fallen from 15 million to 10 million farms. It is also becoming unpleasant for consumers. This development will result in significant price increases, and due to the relocation of production to third countries, consumer safety will also decrease. Now, of course, like you, I do not have a crystal ball and a wishing glass. But it is clear that the rejection of the SUR in the EU Parliament with the votes of the ECR and ID groups can be seen as an initial success. Environmental politics and agricultural politics are not green politics. They require a fact-oriented, reality-based approach. We must therefore no longer leave them to the green socialists, but place them at the core of our conservative agenda. And we have every reason to be more self-confident, and above all, to defend our principles uncompromisingly, because without us, there will be no more conservative majorities in the EU Parliament. I thank you for your attention.